China had an illegal and dangerous biolab in the US, and the CDC and FBI did worse than nothing. Welcome to China Uncensored, I'm Chris Chappell. When it comes to biological research, China's safety record is abysmal. Here, for example, you can see Chinese scientists holding the types of bats that carry coronaviruses without any protective equipment. Dr. Frankenstein has a better track record of safety standards. Yeah, his experiment got loose and terrorized the population, but at least he knew how to wear safety gear. China's recklessness is terrifying, and worse, it's not limited to within China's borders. Earlier this year, authorities uncovered a secret Chinese biotech lab in Reedley, California, that contained 20 potentially infectious agents, including COVID, HIV, hepatitis, and herpes. I haven't seen that many diseases floating around in one place outside of the chocolate fountain in a Golden Corral. So that's encouraging, knowing this kind of thing is going on in the United States. I wonder how many more of these illegal labs there are. Well, I'm not the only one asking that. It was that question, among others, which prompted the United States House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party to investigate, and what they found was frankly shocking. The committee released a report earlier this month about the Reedley Biolab. According to the report, the lab was discovered in December of 2022 when a code enforcement officer noticed a green garden hose sticking out of the side of what was supposed to be a vacant warehouse. She investigated further and found several code violations and safety issues right alongside samples labeled as pathogens and a large number of lab mice.
Concern was immediately raised after the lab was found with at least 20 different infectious agents, from herpes to malaria, COVID, all being stored inadequately, messy, right? You're looking at some of the images from inside. Investigators also discovered nearly 1,000 mice being bioengineered and caged in inhumane conditions. Many of them were dead when they got there.
Local authorities reported what they found to the FBI and the CDC, but the House committee report shows how both the FBI and the CDC dropped the ball by essentially ignoring concerns over the Chinese biolab and dragging their feet when they finally did investigate. Because when have Chinese biolabs not following code ever been a problem for all of humanity? Am I right? What's next? You're going to ask them to hurry up and investigate screams coming from the trunk of a car? Quit being so paranoid. According to the House committee, approximately 2 months after the code enforcer reported the situation to the FBI informed her that it had closed its investigation because the Bureau believed there were no weapons of mass destruction on the property. Ah, well, I guess that's the end of it then. Carry on. The CDC's response was even worse. After inspecting the Chinese biolab in March 2023, local officials reportedly spent months trying to get help from the CDC. Months? Why months? Well, according to local officials, the CDC refused to speak with them, and on a number of occasions, it was reported by local authorities that the CDC hung up on them mid-conversation. According to the report, it was only after local officials contacted the area's representative, Jim Costa, that the CDC responded to California state and local requests for investigation. But even then, the CDC did an absolutely sloppy job. According to the House committee, the CDC visited the site from May 2nd to May 4th. It was then that the CDC concluded that the Chinese biolab had 20 potentially infectious agents. But CDC officials confirmed that the CDC made this list of pathogens based solely on the labels that were placed on samples. The CDC did not test these samples to assess whether the listed labels were correct. The CDC did not even test the wholly unlabeled samples. If only police were that trusting. No, officer, that isn't cocaine. As you can see, it's clearly labeled sugar. I assume I'm free to go now. By the way, there were packages labeled as drugs at the lab too. What kind of experiments were they doing in the lab? But the CDC didn't test any of it. Shouldn't it be their job to check and verify? Why else would Americans be paying tax dollars to fund them? Strangely, the CDC was reportedly adamant about not testing samples, even when local officials offered to pay all of the costs. The CDC even instructed state officials not to test the remaining samples. If someone ever tells you, "You can trust me, we don't need to get tested," run away and sanitize yourself immediately. Instead, state officials following a County of Fresno court order were forced to get rid of more than 100 tons of general waste and almost 450 gallons of medical and biological waste with very little guidance from federal experts in July. No tests, samples destroyed, situation dealt with. Whew, glad that's over with. Only that's not even the worst of it. I'll tell you more after the break. Welcome back. The CDC investigated an illegal biolab in California containing vials labeled as infectious agents, but they didn't test the contents of any of the vials, even the ones that were unlabeled, so no one really knows what was in them. Then everything was destroyed. But the, let's call it, incompetence doesn't stop there. According to the committee report, while destroying the contents of the lab, local officials discovered a freezer labeled Ebola with silver-sealed bags inside. It's one of the deadliest viruses with a mortality rate ranging from 25 to 90% depending on the strain, and yet it wasn't listed as one of the 20 potential infectious agents the CDC found. The only reason I can think of is because Ebola isn't potentially infectious, it's definitely infectious, especially when you store it like leftover spaghetti. Local officials emailed the CDC to see if a freezer labeled Ebola counted as a select agent, a special category of biological agents and toxins that have the potential to pose a severe threat to the public. Select agent. That's the word of the day. Remember it and scream real loud when you hear it. It'll be important later. In an email correspondence with local officials about it, a CDC official said, yes, we would typically look for the vial to be labeled as Ebola to make it a select agent, not the entire freezer, but that they didn't recall seeing a fridge labeled as Ebola. The CDC asked for a picture, but whoops, there wasn't any, and there was no chance to take one when everything was already disposed of. This might be the first time anyone's ever said this, but government officials everywhere need to hire Gen Z influencers. This way they'll get pictures of everything. I have so many questions, like who was in charge of this debacle? And the cringe doesn't even end there. In subsequent conversations with the CDC in September, local officials asked why they refused to test the materials found in the Chinese biolab. A CDC official informed the local officials that it was illegal for the CDC to test any samples that were not expressly labeled as a select agent. Yeah, I want to scream real loud too. Wow, so apparently all you have to do is not label some deadly biohazard and it's okay to carry around. The CDC says its authority is limited to select agents. So, City Manager Nicole Ziba asked if the CDC had any authority to stop a terrorist in the United States who simply removed the label off of a vial of deadly viruses. The CDC official said that the CDC had no authority to test the deadly virus in that hypothetical, and that it was a noted gap in its authority. I really want to scream real loud. But the committee report questions this statement since the CDC does do tests regardless of labels. It did so when anthrax-laced letters terrorized Washington, D.C. and New York. It's almost like the CDC doesn't want to know what's in that lab. Kind of the same way I don't want to know what's in those gas station hot dogs I eat every week. They're delicious, don't ruin it for me. The CDC responded to the House Committee's report saying the CDC strongly disputes the report's conclusions critical of the agency. The report includes numerous inaccuracies, including both the charge that CDC did not respond to local requests for aid and the false implication that CDC had the authority to unilaterally investigate or seize samples from PBI's Reedley building. Indeed, CDC has and continues to be actively engaged within its regulatory authorities in intergovernmental efforts to address issues surrounding the facility. But who has what authority is a serious concern here. The FBI didn't care about the lab because it didn't have weapons of mass destruction. And the CDC didn't care much about the lab because it didn't contain labeled select agents. So whose job is it to keep track of this sort of thing? The lab was in the middle of Reedley, near a railway station, a high school, city hall, water towers, and a supermarket. There are definite public health implications here. Also, the companies involved in the Chinese Biolab, Universal Meditech Incorporated, and Prestige Biotech Incorporated reportedly disposed of dead mice without the use of a licensed medical waste hauler. On top of that, one of the workers handling the 1,000 mice and his family reportedly got sick. With what? Nobody knows. I'm sure it's not a big deal though. I mean, it's not like there's ever been a historic plague that started from an infected rodent. If it did, those would be some dark ages. Meanwhile, AP dismissed concerns as conspiracy theories because air and water tests didn't show contamination, which is just bizarre. It seems like at least the man in charge of the lab should have been on federal authorities' radar. That man is Jiabei Jesse Zhu, a Chinese citizen who has connections with people and organizations involved in China's military-civilian fusion and the CCP's United Front Work Department. Zhu made headlines in 2016 when he fled from a Canadian court battle requiring him to pay $330 million in damages for stealing American, cattle-related intellectual property. I get that he may have slipped through the cracks when he escaped into the US under the alias David He, but he continued to use these same corporations and people from China who helped his Canadian ventures in the US. So there was definitely a serious communication gap somewhere. But this wouldn't be the first time that US authorities have ignored alarms over Chinese biological experiments. Look no further than the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases' response to warnings about the Wuhan Institute of Virology. More after the break. Welcome back. The US has a pretty poor track record of putting checks on irresponsible Chinese biological research. Recently, Vanity Fair did an in-depth expose on the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. It shows how absolutely complacent US health officials are with China. As I've covered before, there were warnings long before the pandemic concerning the Wuhan Institute of Virology's substandard safety measures. There were tons of huge red flags, and I'm not just talking about this one. But it turns out US health officials for years were keenly aware that this was a huge problem, especially after a US health official toured the Wuhan Institute's Biosafety Level 4 lab in October 2017, the same one that was being funded to research coronaviruses. The health official emailed her superiors warning about how Wuhan staff had to learn from scratch how to operate Biosafety Level 4 labs. She also reported hearing from a technician that researchers at the lab intended to use a technique called reverse genetics to create Ebola in the lab so they could study it. Apparently they said it was safer than transporting it. Some people in US health agencies didn't want public concerns to get in the way of collaboration between the NIAID and the Wuhan Institute. So in response to the health official's emailed report on the Wuhan lab, an official said, "I don't want the information, particularly using reverse genetics to create viruses, to get out, which would affect the ability for our future information gain." Far too many people in the scientific community are willfully blind to the security risks China poses. Mark Lipsitch, for example, professor of epidemiology at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, thinks it is almost always beneficial to exchange ideas and samples with other countries, particularly those with different climates than our own. I don't see why science funding should be reserved for friendly countries. You know, if you want to exchange ideas and samples from somewhere with a different climate, try Antarctica. There are those who are keenly aware of the security risks, though, like the Department of Energy. They butted heads with the NIH over security concerns. In 2016, the Department of Energy warned that advanced genetic engineering techniques could be misused and developed a proposal to ramp up safeguards to better detect evidence of genetic engineering. But former NIH Director Francis Collins dismissed their concerns, saying, "You got this out of a movie. This reads like a movie script." We don't know exactly what he was responding to, but chances are he was responding to something along the lines of genetically engineered ethnic bioweapons that would target people of certain races, which a Chinese general has specifically said China is pursuing. Health officials should know better than to trust, much less collaborate with Chinese scientists. Otherwise, they're putting a lot of lives at risk. And yet, people are willing to risk it all in the name of science. Canada risked it all when it allowed a Chinese scientist to send Ebola viruses to Wuhan. The same scientist who would later be escorted out of Canada's Biosafety Level 4 lab for undisclosed reasons. Vanity Fair notes that when that scientist requested permission to export Ebola, Canada didn't get proof that the Wuhan lab was a certified Biosafety Level 4 lab. Because why would they? Just throw Ebola in the freezer next to the leftover spaghetti and it'll be fine. And make sure not to label it. Bureaucrats simply accepted a letter from a Wuhan Institute official that said, "I trust the lab and would be personally fine to sign off." There are now concerns of Chinese military scientists accessing Canada's Biosafety Level 4 lab and collaborations with the PLA that potentially involve intellectual property transfers. Who knows what Chinese scientists are up to with dangerous pathogens like Ebola and coronaviruses, but health officials should know by now just how stupid it is to let collaboration take priority over security. Will they learn? Who knows? I'd say Dr. Frankenstein has a better chance of turning over a new leaf, and he's dead and fictional. Now I got a video I want to show you that I think will tickle your fancy. But first, it's time to show some love to the people who make this show possible. The China Uncensored 50-cent army, fans who support the show on patreon.com/China Uncensored. As my way of thanks, I answer their questions at the end of these episodes. Today's question comes from Ian Pendleton. Will the CCP police forces ever be folded into the party's military, or is that not possible for some reason? That's an excellent question, Ian. I don't think that will ever happen, and there's an important reason why. Broadly speaking, there are two centers of power in Communist China, the military and the Public Security Bureau. Basically the forces that would fight foreign countries and the forces that fight Chinese people. Different bureaucracies control these two sides of China's security forces. In fact, for a good long time, China was putting more money into policing its own citizens than the military. Different party factions have vied for control of these branches. Putting police under the military would mean a bunch of people would be out of powerful and lucrative positions. They would never let that happen. Thanks for your question and your support, Ian. And if you want to know more about how China could ignite the next pandemic, check out this video. For all we know, it might come a lot sooner than we expect. And if you want to support China Uncensored on Patreon, click that orange button. Our health depends on you. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.